Hi friends, and welcome to the very first episode of my brand new podcast, Crime and Curiosities. I'm your host, Charlie, and I'm excited to share my love of all things true crime, history, mystery, and morbid with you. Since I was a child, I have had a fascination with unsolved mysteries, unexplained phenomena, history, crime, and other morbid curiosities like rare diseases, epidemics, and even parasites. I'm not joking. Have you ever watched Monsters Inside Me? I've seen every single episode. Anyways, this love extended into adulthood, where I studied political science and psychology in university and continued to consume anything true crime, unexplained, or mysterious. In this podcast, I hope to share my love for all of these topics with you, my listeners and friends, and finally put some of this so-called useless knowledge that I've acquired over the years to some good use. With that being said, I am definitely not a professional, and producing a podcast has presented a steep learning curve for me. Please be patient as I work on my editing skills, as well as the format of the show. I would love to hear any feedback or constructive criticism you may have, and links will be provided in the description for my Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. My friend Jess has created my awesome cover art and logo, so a huge thank you to her, and also a huge thank you to my friend Jared, who has graciously provided my theme music. He's a great music producer and a close friend of mine, and I will provide the link to his Spotify below so you can check out his music. Another huge thank you to my focus group of friends who provided feedback about the show, as well as support and enthusiasm for this project. Thank you so much. I'm forever grateful, and I hope that you especially enjoy the show. Okay, now that introductions are out of the way, let's get into our very first case. A case that I've known about my whole life and has always intrigued and confused me. Where is Kimberly McAndrew? How can someone disappear in broad daylight on a sunny summer afternoon, leaving no trace and never to be seen again? Kimberly McAndrew was born on January 17, 1970, to her parents Cyril and Audrey McAndrew. She had 4 sisters, Heather, Megan, Erin, and Carla, and a brother, James. She grew up in the town of Parrsboro, Nova Scotia, and I've known about this story since I was quite young, because I grew up just outside of Parrsboro and went to school there up until grade 11. Parrsboro is a very small town, with one main street lined with small shops and not a whole lot going on. There's an elementary and high school, a bank, a grocery store, a pharmacy, some gift shops and restaurants, but not much else. Back when I lived there were 2 grocery stores, and my dad worked at one of them. Although our family did not know the McAndrews personally, my dad said that the kids were very friendly, and he often seen them out for walks, where they would wave when he drove by, even though they didn't know my dad personally. This would have been after Kimberly's disappearance, and my dad did mention that you almost never saw one of the kids walking alone. The mentality of a small town comes into play when discussing Kimberly's disappearance later, so please keep that in mind. Kimberly's disappearance has always stayed with me, after hearing my family talk about it as I grew up, and I've always felt that this case deserves some more attention. As I grew older and grew more interested in true crime and mystery, Kimberly was always at the back of my mind. I wanted to know more. And when I began to watch true crime videos and listen to podcasts, I wished that Kimberly's case had been more often covered. As soon as I started a podcast, I knew that I wanted to cover Kimberly's case. The summer that she went missing, Kimberly was 19 years old and lived with her sister in Halifax, Nova Scotia, on the east coast of Canada, where she attended Dalhousie University. Kimberly was a happy, well-adjusted young woman who is described as being intelligent and outgoing and having a sharp sense of humor. Kimberly was small, around 5'3", with brunette hair, and looked younger than her 19 years, in part because of the braces she wore, which her family says she absolutely couldn't wait to get removed. On the afternoon of August 12, 1989, Kimberly left her summer job as a cashier at Canadian Tire on Quinpool Road in Halifax. She left a little bit early that day because it was a slow day and her supervisor told her she could go home. It was her boyfriend's birthday and they had plans to go to a party afterwards, so undoubtedly Kimberly was happy that she got to leave early. She clocked out at 4:12 in the afternoon, but Kimberly McAndrews was never seen again. At 5 p.m., the time that Kimberly was supposed to be finished her shift, her sister Erin, as well as her boyfriend and Kimberly's boyfriend, showed up at the Canadian Tire to pick Kimberly up from work. But she wasn't there. She had left early, but had never arrived back at the apartment she shared with her sister, just a 15-minute walk from the Canadian Tire on Quinpool Road. In order to get home, Kimberly would have had to walk along the route that her sister drove to pick her up, but there had been no sign of her along the route. The trio drove along the area looking for her before returning to the apartment to see if she had shown up there. When she hadn't, Erin called her parents to let them know that Kimberly had not come home from work. It seemed impossible to her family that she would disappear willingly, because Kimberly was well-liked, had a good relationship, and was making good grades in school. She had no reason to leave on her own. Her family was also insistent that she would never have gotten into a vehicle with a stranger. Her sister Megan says she didn't even like to walk alone in her hometown of Parisbro, with a population of around 1,200 people at the time, without someone going with her, so it would be completely out of character for her to accept a ride from someone she didn't know. And since it was a beautiful day, she would have most likely walked home. Nothing was missing from the apartment, and Kimberly's bank account remained untouched. She had simply vanished. Kimberly's disappearance was picked up pretty quickly by the local media, and local police soon began receiving tips about where Kimberly may be. One of the first major tips to come in was from an employee at the Gardenia Flower Shop in the Penhorn Mall, located in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. This employee said that a young woman closely matching Kimberly's description had been in the flower shop between 4:30 and 5 p.m. and had purchased a balloon and a single rose. At first, this makes sense, because it was Kimberly's boyfriend's birthday, but what doesn't make sense is that Kimberly would go all the way to Penhorn Mall to make this purchase. The mall was 15 minutes away from Kimberly's work by car, and there were plenty of other flower shops close to home that she could have went to. Also, since Kimberly didn't own a car of her own, this means she would have had to take a cab or other transport, or face an hour-and-a-half walk across the bridge into Dartmouth, which doesn't seem likely since she wouldn't even walk alone to get a Diet Coke from the gas station in her rural hometown. Also, if she left work at around 4:15, she wouldn't have made it to the flower store by foot by the time she was said to have been seen there, between 4:30 and 5 p.m. Kimberly's sister says that she also very would have likely come straight home first, as she knew her sister was supposed to pick her up at 5 and would have wanted to catch her before she left the apartment to pick her up. Remember, this was a time that there was no cell phones, so the sisters had no way of communicating. It has never been confirmed that it truly was Kimberly at the flower shop that day, although the sighting has been reported so many times that some news outlets list it as the last time Kimberly was seen. But I personally don't see it as likely, as the times and circumstances just don't match up. Kimberly's sister and boyfriend have both been cleared of any involvement in her disappearance. As a note in this case, Kimberly's father Cyril was an investigator with the RCMP, or Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And just 2 months after Kimberly's disappearance, and with no solid leads, he retired from the Mounties, as we call them here in Canada, and focused solely on investigating his daughter's disappearance. Cyril was dedicated to finding his daughter, and I can't imagine what it was like for him to investigate his own daughter's disappearance, knowing what he knew as a police officer. It just shows how much Kimberly meant to her family, and how determined they were to find her. Sadly, Kimberly's father Cyril passed away in 2004 without ever finding out what had happened to his daughter. Over the years, police have processed hundreds of tips, investigated multiple sightings, conducted hundreds of interviews, and administered polygraph tests in regards to Kimberly's case. All of this to no avail. In 1995, 6 years after her disappearance, police announced that they believed Kimberly had never left the parking lot of Canadian Tire that day, or at least not on her own, meaning that she had either accepted a ride or more likely had been abducted. Sightings of Kimberly have come from as far away as New York City and British Columbia, and the family has had to endure multiple instances where it was believed that they may find out what happened to Kimberly, including a false report that she had been found safe in Ontario which is just a few provinces over, and a misleading tip from a prison inmate. Frustrated at the lack of progress in the case, Halifax police even had a well-known psychic brought onto the investigation, who had worked multiple other cases and had some success. This psychic, named Noreen Rayner, even worked for the FBI at one point, so investigators hoped she could bring some insight into the case. Rayner participated in 3 calls, or sessions, with investigators, as well as Kimberly's mother and her sister, but honestly, not much came of it. Now, whether or not you believe in psychics, or even if I do, is a whole other subject and maybe a whole other episode, but all I can present to you is what we know as it relates to this case. I will provide a link below where you can listen to all 3 sessions in their entirety if you're interested, but I did my best to break things down here. During her first call, Rayner was asked by Kimberly's mother if the person who took Kimberly had anything belonging to her, like personal effects. Rayner answered, eventually, that they did, and it was something thin, a word she kept repeating over and over, thin, 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 before finally saying that the item would be like a thin bracelet or thin underwear. So yeah, take what you want from that. The second call was slightly more productive, as Rayner said that Kimberly was in Point Pleasant Park, a nearby park that used to be part of Halifax's defense system. She even told investigators that they had been close to Kimberly when they searched there, using the measurements of 10 to 12, but saying she was unable to specify whether or not that was yards, feet, inches, etc. The park is covered in forest and still has remnants of structures that existed when it was part of the city's defense system, so it's not that it's unlikely that you would find a body there, but no trace of Kimberly was ever found. Between sessions 2 and 3 with the psychic, police spoke to a new suspect in the case. Apparently, some of what this unnamed suspect detailed to the police matched up with some of the information that the psychic had provided, as you can hear if you listen to the recordings. So this guy basically said that he had picked Kimberly up from the Canadian Tire parking lot and took her to Dartmouth to murder her, before returning to Halifax and burying her in Point Pleasant Park. These were all apparently details that Noreen had given police in her sessions, including something about a bridge, which you do have to cross to get between Halifax and Dartmouth. Now, when researching the case and listening to other podcasts or true crime videos about Kimberly's case, there is always a man brought up who was obsessed with Kimberly. Now, the general consensus seems to be that this man is the same suspect that the police spoke to between sessions 2 and 3 with the psychic. And although I couldn't find any concrete confirmation of this, it does make sense, so I'm gonna stick with the crowd on this one. Now, this man is said to have been, like I mentioned, obsessed with Kimberly, both when she was alive and after her death. And police found novels worth of writing that he had handwritten about Kimberly, and he was even confirmed to have had contact with Kimberly on the day she went missing. A search of his apartment found sadistic literature, pictures of Kimberly, and newspaper clippings regarding her case. He told police that he may be able to show them where Kimberly was, but when they searched the area in Point Pleasant Park where he described Kimberly as being, there was absolutely no trace of her. It is interesting to note, at least to me, that this psychic was brought in after a routine refresh of cold case files, where the case was reassigned to Detective Dave McDonald. Now, I've read some articles online, one in particular, that really tear Detective McDonald apart for mishandling the case, bringing in the psychic, and going on a wild goose chase based on her sessions. Now, I'm not saying that what the detective did in the case was right or wrong, and I do agree that bringing in the psychic was questionable, and especially involving her mother and sister in the sessions, but I try not to come down too hard on this guy. Resources are often stretched, and in the case of Kimberly, police had literally nothing to go on. Noreen herself, the psychic, said that she believes psychics should be a last resort in missing persons cases, and I think that Detective McDonald felt she was his last option. He has gone on to say that he feels that he trusted the wrong people in regards to the case, and I have to wonder, although it isn't confirmed, if maybe this was in reference to Noreen, the psychic. Although there has been a few suspects in Kimberly's case, including the man mentioned above, no one has been formally charged in Kimberly's disappearance. But there is one suspect who sticks out from the rest. Andrew Paul Johnson lived in the Halifax area at the time. In fact, his girlfriend lived across the street from the Canadian Tire where Kimberly worked. Johnson is a sex offender and is currently serving time in British Columbia for the attempted abduction of 3 different 12-year-old girls and the successful abduction of a 20-year-old woman, using the ruse of being a police officer to try to lure them into his car. The woman that he successfully abducted had some level of mental impairment, according to the Global TV article that I read, and she was in the car with Johnson when he was finally arrested by police. Also found in that car were a meat cleaver, a mask, pornographic material, lube, and handcuffs. Johnson has a criminal record dating back to the 1990s, which included masturbating in front of young children, aggravated assault, and kidnapping and forcible confinement. As part of a sex offender treatment program in relation to his BC convictions, Johnson was asked to write an essay about a sexual assault from the victim's point of view. He wrote a chilling account of Kimberly McAndrew's rape and murder, and in 2013, his brother Shad Bay property was searched in relation to Kimberly's case, but no evidence was found. It's also worth noting that he is a suspect in another Nova Scotian cold case, that of Andrea King, whose body was found near the Zachville Business Park 1 year after she was reported missing by her family. Andrea had moved to Nova Scotia just 3 days prior to her disappearance. Johnson is considered a dangerous offender by BC's courts and has been denied parole multiple times due to his dangerous offender status, as well as being suspected in both Kimberly and Andrea's cold cases. His attorneys deny that he had any involvement, but Kimberly's family remains hopeful that they will find out what happened to their daughter and sister. To my knowledge, Kimberly's mother is still alive, and I can't imagine the heartbreak and emptiness she must feel, having been without her daughter for nearly 30 years. The ups and downs her family has had to face are just heartbreaking, and I imagine it must only get harder as the years pass and there still aren't any concrete answers as to what happened to Kimberly. Originally, when planning this episode, I wasn't going to discuss theories about what might have happened to Kimberly, mostly because at this point I think it's pretty obvious that she's met with some foul play, and I've loosely covered what may or may not have happened to her throughout this podcast. Also, since there's so little information or evidence in Kimberly's case, and she has been missing for such a long time, it's difficult to find a lot of information besides the basics. After some thought, I've decided to recap and discuss what could have happened to Kimberly, and what I think is the most likely possibility. That way, I can provide some points of discussion for everyone to sort of think on and talk about. First of all, I'll start with the theory that I think is least likely, and that's that Kimberly simply just got up and left. People who disappear on their own accord don't often make plans for the day ahead, and by all accounts, Kimberly was in good spirits leading up to her disappearance. Nothing was missing from the apartment, and no money was ever taken from her bank account, which means Kimberly would have had to basically start over fresh somewhere, and as a 19-year-old girl at the time, I can't imagine that would have been very easy for her. But the reason I really don't think that this happened, nor did the police or Kimberly's family, is just because of who Kimberly was as a person. The McAndrews seemed like a close-knit family, and there is simply no evidence pointing to Kimberly having a motive to just get up and leave. Also, it seems very unlikely that she wouldn't have either been found or have contacted her family by now. After all, it has been nearly 30 years, and her case has garnered quite a bit of media coverage. So that leads to the most logical, most likely scenario. And even though it's also the most heartbreaking, it's very likely that Kimberly was abducted and eventually murdered. It's highly unlikely that after 30 years, her captor or captors has kept her alive. And as we mentioned, Kimberly's family doesn't believe she would have willingly got into a vehicle with a stranger that day. It is interesting to note, though, that Andrew Paul Johnson, one of the suspects in Kimberly's case, used the ruse of being a police officer to lure girls into his car. Kimberly's father was a police officer, and I wonder if it was Johnson who took her, that perhaps he made her feel comfortable by saying he was a member of law enforcement. Although you can look at that the opposite way and say that since Kimberly was likely relatively familiar with police procedure, she very likely would not have gotten into an unmarked vehicle with Johnson, at least not willingly. So, as I mentioned, police believe that Kimberly was taken from the Canadian Tire parking lot against her will and murdered. But that begs the question of where Kimberly's remains are and why they haven't been discovered after nearly 3 decades. While researching Kimberly's case, I came across the CTV article which discussed a program initiated by the Nova Scotia government involving long-term unsolved crimes, which I'll discuss in a few moments. Kimberly is one of the many cold cases discussed in this article, but one thing that stood out to me, and that I haven't seen discussed in many other places, is the geographical location of Nova Scotia and Halifax in regards to water. This province is surrounded by water, and a police officer which spoke in the article mentioned that many of these cold cases may never be solved because the bodies have ended up in bodies of water, whether by accident or by foul play. It's not completely unreasonable to believe that whoever abducted Kimberly might have disposed of her body in one of the many bodies of water that are located in and around Halifax and Dartmouth. Both Kimberly's family and police believe that she is met with foul play, and I personally don't think her case will ever be solved. I definitely don't believe Kimberly's disappearance was due to an accident, and I definitely don't think she just got up and walked away. I think that Andrew Paul Johnson should be more closely investigated, although I know that this requires some leads and evidence. Kimberly is one of many cold cases in Nova Scotia and is part of a program through the Nova Scotia government called Rewards for Major Unsolved Crimes, which offers a $150,000 reward to anyone with information which leads to an arrest or conviction in any of the cases involved in the program. Police, as I have stated, believe Kimberly was abducted and killed, and her sister Megan admits that they know that whatever happened to Kimberly wasn't good, but that at this point the family would just like some closure. It absolutely breaks my heart to know that Kimberly's father Cyril passed away without ever knowing what happened to his daughter, who he had worked so hard to find. Even as a true crime buff, it still blows my mind that someone can disappear without a trace. I know it happens all the time, but this one hits particularly close to home. This August will mark 30 years since Kimberly disappeared, and the police are no closer to knowing what happened to Kimberly after she left work that August afternoon. The case of Kimberly McAndrew remains unsolved and is still an open case. Kimberly was last seen at the Canadian Tire on Quinpool Road on August 12, 1989. She was wearing pleated, ankle-length navy cotton slacks with slash pockets in front and one pocket in the back, a white, short-sleeved Esprit t-shirt with red and green squares, a navy cotton oversized cardigan, and jade green flat-heeled slip-on loafers. If you have any information regarding Kimberly McAndrew's disappearance, please contact the Nova Scotia Rewards for Major Crimes program at 1-888-710-9090 or Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-8477 or via the online tip submission form, which can be found on the Crime Stoppers website. Tips submitted through Crime Stoppers are completely anonymous. And there we have it, folks. The unsolved disappearance of Kimberly McAndrew, and my very first episode of Crime and Curiosities. I've done my best to completely and accurately cover the story, but I do encourage you to look into Kimberly's story yourself and form your own opinions. And definitely check out the thread regarding her disappearance on unsolvedcanada.ca, which is sadly relatively short, but worth the read. I will provide the link to a website where you can listen to the psychic sessions, as well as the contact information if you have any information about Kimberly's case on our Facebook page, which you can find by searching Crime and Curiosities. You can also follow the podcast on Twitter at CrimeCuriousPod, all one word. I post updates whenever I can, and I would love to hear everyone's feedback on the first episode. And if you have any suggestions for future episodes, please feel free to send them my way. Once again, thank you for listening, and I'll be back soon with episode 2, which is hopefully a little bit longer than this one. Bye for now, curious pals.